The next common problem we're going to be talking about involves a bit more nuance to it, but it's a super important one, and it's about alternative text, or alt text for short. So alt text is basically a text substitute for an image when the image can't be displayed. And this is a really big one for screen readers because the users aren't usually able to visually see the images on the screen. So they rely on alt text to understand what the image should be. And the biggest problem that I see on most websites is that the images either don't have any alt text at all, or they do have alt text, but it's not really great alt text. And what makes alt text good versus what makes it bad, we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a minute. But generally, good alt text should be descriptive of the image or its function. So I like to split alt text off into these three categories. The first is decorative. So if your image is decorative, as in it serves no other purpose other than making the page look pretty, then we give it blank alt text. Now be aware though that blank alt text and missing alt text are two different things. So blank alt text means that you still include the alt attribute to the image, but the value is blank or empty. So this just tells the screen reader, hey, this image is decorative, we'll skip over it because it's not important. Missing alt text, on the other hand, is when you don't add the alt attribute at all to the image. And we never want to do this because screen readers will still pick up on these images, but they won't be given an appropriate text substitute. So usually they'll read the file name, which might not be very helpful because file names can sometimes just be a random string of numbers and characters. But yeah, to summarize, decorative images provide blank alt text. Plain images, if the image is a plain image, we want to give it alt text that describes the image. And functional images, so functional images are images that is also a link or a button. We want to give these alt text that describes the function of the image rather than the actual image itself. So the first question to ask yourself is, is this a regular plain old image? Is this a decorative image, or is this a functional image? I won't go too much into further detail with decorative images because I think that's pretty straightforward. So let's move on to the other two categories and break them down. So let's start with plain images. I'm going to present you two alt texts. Both refer to the same image, but the way that they describe it is different. So the first alt text is woman looking at a pineapple. So have a think about what kind of image you see in your head when you hear this alt text. The second one is young woman shopping at a supermarket inspecting a pineapple in her hand. Again, have a think about what kind of image you see in your head with this description. And then let's take a look at the actual image these two texts are describing. Hopefully you can all agree that the second one is much closer to what you were imagining. And notice how a good descriptive alt text gives you a way better idea of what's happening in the image. Now the bad alt text, the first one, is not necessarily wrong. I mean, technically it is a woman looking at a pineapple, but because it's not descriptive enough, it can make it hard for people to understand the purpose of the image. Like why is this image here? What kind of information is it trying to convey? And obviously this is just one example. There's multiple other texts that you could use instead. You could go crazy with the details. You could describe what she's wearing and the background and the types of fruits that you can see. And at some point, you're probably going to ask yourself, how detailed do I need to be to write good alt text? And that's something I personally struggled with for a while, and I occasionally do still struggle with to this day, because I didn't know how much I needed to write to make sure that what I wrote was enough and not too much at the same time. And what I found is that honestly, it just depends on the context of your image. So let's just say you are writing an article on COVID and you had this image, and the main point of your article was to talk about social distancing and mask wearing. So the good alt text that we previously came up with, that probably won't be appropriate anymore, because if I was a blind screen reader user reading this article, what value do I get out of knowing that this woman is holding a pineapple? Like, it's not necessarily bad alt text. We're still describing what's happening in the photo, but we also need to think about context and what sort of details we should be including to help users understand the purpose and context of the photo. So in this situation, a slightly better alt text might be something like, young woman wearing a face mask is social distancing as she shops at a supermarket. You can see we no longer focus on the fact that she's looking at a pineapple. You can definitely still include it if you want, but we've shifted our focus more towards the fact that she's wearing a mask and she's keeping her distance. Now let's take a look at example number 2. We're going to be looking at functional images this time, and I'm going to be giving you 2 alt texts again, and you're going to have to think about what these alt texts mean to you. So for context, let's imagine that you're filling out an online form, and this alt text is describing a button. So the square with the question mark that you're about to see is where that button is. So alt text number 1, white rounded edged arrow on a black circle. Alt text number 2, continue to next page. And let's look at the actual image. You'll notice that the 2 alt texts were quite different. The first one was very descriptive of the button's image. It is indeed a white rounded edged arrow on a black circle. But the second alt text in this scenario would actually be much more appropriate than the first. And if you're asking why, this is because this is an element that can be interacted with. So buttons and links need to have slightly different alt text than plain regular images because they serve a function. So with buttons and links, we need to make sure that our alt text actually describes the function of the image rather than the actual image itself. So continue to next page is a lot more helpful in this situation than actually knowing what the arrow looks like. So there is a little bit of thinking involved to find the best alt text for your image, but really the important questions that you need to ask yourself are, does this alt text accurately describe my image or its function? If I replace this image with my alt text, would I still be able to understand the purpose of the image? And do I need to provide any context-specific details from the image? But that's the gist of alt text. I did go into a bit more detail than I needed to for an intro because I know that it can be hard sometimes to write good alt text, and it's not always the most straightforward thing. But just keep in mind that you don't need it to be perfect, as long as you think about how your alt text is going to help your users, how you're going to use it to communicate the right information and help them do the things that they need to do, then that's really all there is to it. So just to summarize, if it's decorative, give it blank alt text. If it's a plain regular image, give it alt text that describes the image. And if it's a link or a button, then give it alt text that describes the function.